Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Josh Epstein. I'm the marketing specialist for TDA Perks. Welcome to today's webinar. It's how to choose the optimal practice location. So today we'll cover how dentists are using a data-driven approach to site selection, as well as proven strategies for opening a practice efficiently and effectively. Today's speaker is Mr. Blake Johnson. He's a senior associate with longtime Perks partner XITE Realty. If you're not familiar with TDA Perks and what we do for TDA members, we endorse over 20 vendors that are available to assist your practice, from compliance and dental supplies to insurance, real estate, marketing, and more. We also offer educational journal articles and archive webinars in the resource section of the TDA Perks site, and that's tdaperks.com. One other announcement I really want to make. I want to make sure everyone knows about the new TDA Dental Concierge app. It's a free TDA member app that will enable you to track your CE that you've completed and see what you lack, as well as getting high quality courses that you need at a low cost. You can easily transfer information to TSBDE to comply with its auditing process. So it's just something that the TDA has developed, and it's 100% free to TDA members. So I definitely urge you to check that out. You can find out more information about that at tdadentalconcierge.com. So with that said, Blake, you ready to go?
Yeah, I appreciate it, Donna. So really want to do my best to kind of educate you guys on the proper steps to take on opening a practice, with that, also being a data-driven approach and also looking at markets and different things. But to kind of give you a background on me, so my name is Blake Johnson, medical real estate broker in the city of Houston. And so we specialize in guiding doctors through opening their practices. Obviously we have taken a data-driven approach because we have seen really the need and the tailored demographics that doctors need in order to find the proper location to open up their clinics. And so we started back in about 2013. We're 4 partners with XITE Realty. We're working currently with Patterson, at that time, and then ended up moving to a company called Jackson Cooksey, and ended up opening the healthcare division there. And so then at that point, they, realized, hey, these doctors needed representation on these deals. And so they really wanted to streamline the process. And so they really wanted to make it a data-driven approach, really make it a very simple process for you guys. And so that's what they did, and they started XITE Realty. I joined the team back in 2017, and it's really been an amazing fit. I wanted to help people and really guide people in opening their practices and really help them through their journey, because it's going to be a spot that you're going to drive to, every single day for 10, 20 years and pretty much build your career there. And so it's a really beneficial and really encouraging to see the final income, but we want to put you in the right spot. We'll put you in the spot that's going to be successful. And so we want to put you in the optical practice location. And so really putting you in the right place. You're considering opening, expanding your clinic, or whatever it is. Like I said earlier, we really want to look at the demographics, really look at the data, and really drive down on those points. And there will be, at the beginning of this, some slides that I'll kind of blast through, because I really want to get to the really the infographics here in just a little bit. But what we want to consider and what we want to think about, okay, is what kind of patients do we want to serve? So if we're looking to have, a Medicaid practice, or if you're an ortho and you're looking to, serve kids or teenagers, we really want to look at that information. There's going to be a lot of questions, that we'll have in the first meeting, and kind of educating you guys, and educating us on what you're looking to do. So that's one, looking at the type of patients that you want to see, whether that's Medicaid, fee-for-service, PPO, and really looking at that info, because that's going to dictate, where we can look at in the market. And using Houston as an example, if we're looking to open a Medicaid practice, usually in the Memorial City area, you're not going to be pulling much Medicaid there. It's more of a fee-for-service area. Obviously us being local in Houston, we know where the Medicaid areas are, where the fee-for-service practices are, but you want to take that into consideration. And even some doctors, want to say, hey, I would rather serve the older community, dentures or fillings or whatever it is. And so I really want to be by that. And so what we do is we take that information and all the information that you give us, and we tailor it to you guys. So what we do is we take that information, we go out in the market. Obviously we're experts in the market, so we know traditionally where those areas are, but we still want to look at the demographic numbers to really drive down that information, and really help us be more precise on where we find a location. And again, I give you guys background on me, but 2017, really been rocking and rolling on this for a while, but that's my job. I want to tailor it to you, and we want to make it a very close-knit relationship, because the more feedback that we get from you guys whenever we end up going and looking for the optimal spot that fits what you're looking for, the better. Because again, you're going to be driving to that spot every single day for the next 10, 20 years, and so we really want to drive in on a location that matches what you want to serve. And so when we do that, one, we put you in an area that you can be successful, where the competition ratio is good, and I'll get to that here in just a little bit, but competition ratio is good, and it matches the patients you want to see, and you're happy. And I gave you a little guys about us. Obviously you started in 2013, but we mentioned we do startups. We also do expansions, relocations, and different things. Now, I will say, with a startup and expansion, and relocation, they're a little different things. As far as a startup goes, sometimes doctors really go off of where they've worked, whether that's good or bad. So an example would be, I had a doctor one time came to me and he said, "Hey, I'm working in this corporate office. It's really turn and burn, getting patients in, patients out fairly quickly, but I don't really want my practice to be like that. I really want it more of a neighborhood friendly, really family practice that is not turn and burn. It's really more focused on the patient." So that's what we did. We look at that information. We really look at the neighborhoods, look at outskirts of Houston or middle parts of Houston that really match what you're looking for. And a lot of times it comes down to what your practice looks like, what your marketing looks like, and really just your preference on what you want to do. Now, as far as a relocation, relocations are usually a little easier. So we have been able to take relocations and make it pretty simple, simply because you already know where you're pulling your patients. And so for those, it's really just finding an opportunity. One, because usually when you're relocating, your lease is up, and you're having to either expand or you're just not happy with the landlord or whatever that is. And so what we do is we find the area where you're pulling your patients, and we sit and take your current practice and we say, "Hey, where is going to be the best opportunity for us to, one, to expand, and two, to be able to pull most of those patients back?" Because what we don't want to do is relocate and you lose more of the patients than you thought you would. And so we really want to hone in on where you're currently at, and really drive those numbers and figure out and make sure that we really do our due diligence on that relocation. Because a lot of times some people think, "Oh, it's just down the road, it's not going to make a difference." Well, we have to take into consideration where exits are on the highway, how easy it is, where your patient's driving to you from. And so there's a lot of data points that we really need to hit, and we really need to go into and really dive deep into. Expansions can go separate ways. It can be either you are, again, looking to relocate and just expand to a bigger space, you've outgrown your current location, or you're wanting to find the patient base across the city or somewhere else in the city that matches what you're currently doing also. Because you can grow a practice in that type of patients, and so you want to really put in a second location in the same area, or not in the same area, that it also had the same demographic report as where your current practice is. And so these are really one of my favorite slides, because this is exactly what you're going to see whenever we're going out and we're looking at the demographics. So whenever you're looking to open a practice, all right, Blake, I've given you the information. Let's go out and find the area that matches that. So what we do is we look at this population, and hopefully you guys can see my cursor. If not, the population is under key facts. So we want to look at the population of the area. We want to look at the median age, because what that's going to do is give you an idea of, okay, if I want to see older patients, obviously we want that median age to be fairly high. If I want to see, retired or in their 50s, 60s, we really want to drive into that median age to make it. The higher it is, the better for those kind of practices. Now, obviously the opposite can be the case, where if you're wanting to serve, kids, we want that median age to be really closer to around 30, 34, simply because usually at those ages, parents have kids. And so that's usually when they're, kids are around 7, 8 years old. If you plan on doing ortho, which usually if you're doing pediatrics, you'll do a little bit of ortho. Some people are, more specialized, but we want to hone in on that information. And again, average household size, right under population. If we want to see kids, if we're doing ortho, we want that number to be very high. The median household income, this is pretty important. So a lot of times we can determine, a lot of times it's relative, I should say. Median household income at $70,000 can be totally different when you're looking at, I'll use like Waller, Texas, for example, versus, Memorial City. The median household income is not going to be $70,000 in Memorial City, but a median household income will give us the type of patients we want to see as far as it comes to fee-for-service, Medicaid, or PPO. And so we really hone in that median household income to help us with that. Obviously, the most important thing that we look at is this dental competition ratio. Now, the ADA recommends 1,700 to 1. We always look for 2,000 to 1. Now, that's in the city of Houston, even on the outskirts. I've had several, I'll say people come to me and think that there's going to be an opportunity where the competition ratio is 10,000 to 1 or 13,000 to 1. The likelihood of that in Houston is extremely rare. And usually the expectations are not at the point that they need to be. And so we encourage doctors to really understand that the competition ratio between 1,700 and higher is good, but our job is to put you in the right spot and put you in a spot where you can be successful. And so we always look for 2,000 to 1. One, because we think that's a safe number for us to hit based off of our algorithms and different things that we've ran and really understanding the markets. And so we look for 2,000 to 1. And anything higher than that, it's good. Now, we're going to put this on a 1 to 3 to 5 mile radius. And so that's going to pull us different, dental competition ratios. But with that, we have to be aware of how long, basically where the natural barriers are. So to give an example, in Houston, obviously, you have your 610 loop and it's, a giant circle, and you have I-10 coming across. Well, on major highways, the north and the south side of those major highways can look totally different. And a lot of times patients won't drive across major highways to get to their practice, to their doctor that they want to see. Simply, and it's nothing on, the doctor, it's just simply natural barriers tend to be a blockade for people to go to those areas. And so we have to be aware of that. And so with that competition ratio, a lot of times the radius is not going to be the most accurate thing. And so what we'll do is we'll put it on a drive time or a custom polygon, or we'll be able to customize, that, I'll put in quotations, that radius, when really it's not a radius as in a circle, but we can customize that to really know where we're pulling those patients and see what the true competition ratio is. This stuff underneath, population by age, like I said earlier, super important for us to see. If we want to serve older, we want this number to be higher. If we like families, obviously we look at this number 18 to 34, 18 or less. If we want to see families with kids, we want that number to be lower. Insurance, this really tells us, is it a fee for service? Is it Medicaid? We really drive into that information. But I like the infographics, which is what this whole thing is called, a little more than say the heat maps. And I only say that because it's simple. It's a lot simpler. The heat maps can get really detailed. And so a lot of times your natural barriers can be very small. I know I mentioned the highways, and those are very big natural barriers that you can see. But even on where parks are and different things, we really want to make sure that we pay attention to those things. And so sometimes heat maps won't necessarily show those, but the heat maps are good to show the median household income or the population growth. So a lot of times, and I like to go into this when it comes to population growth, a lot of times doctors ask me, okay, is it better for me to buy an existing practice, or is it better for me to do a startup? So there's pros and cons to both. So a existing practice, obviously the biggest pro is, okay, I've got patients right off the bat. Well, the biggest con of that is usually in those practices, the areas that they are usually in non-growing areas, meaning the population growth is pretty much stale. And so what tends to happen when you buy an existing practice is you end up losing some of those patients, usually about 20 to 30%. Now, that's nothing on you. It's just simply that the doctors, that they were used to going to has left, and so they have since moved on, and so now they're going to go somewhere else, or they were driving a pretty far distance away, and so they're just no longer going to go there. So then you have to consider, okay, where am I going to pull those patients from? And so this is really important for us to look at the population growth. Is the area still growing? Is it a good opportunity? And so you really want to hone in on that. Now, on a startup, the biggest con is, okay, you don't have patients right off the bat. And so that's our job, is to find you those patients. And so that's where we want to put you in the right spot. And so usually in the areas that are new, coming up, startups that you do are in areas that are growing or changing. So a lot of times people, Spring Branch is a perfect example in Houston that, it used to be pretty heavy Medicaid, and now it's slowly starting to change. Whereas the Heights is the same example. That used to be a very heavily Medicaid area, and it is now fee for service. It is complete opposite now. And so we want to look at those things. So usually on a startup, you may not have patients right off the bat, but it's usually an area where you can grow, and the ceiling for a startup is usually significantly higher than buying an existing practice. And there's other things that we can go into at another time, but those are usually the biggest two things when it comes to a startup and existing practice. And a lot of times doctors just have questions on that. Similar to what I was saying earlier, density factor, understanding the intensity of the land use in the area. Is it a flood zone? Is it not? Really honing in on those things, because a lot of times we look for those things, especially in Houston. We look for those things to be, flood zones or situations like that kind of can be a potential threat to your practice. And so we look at those things, we make sure that you're going to be in an area that's not going to have any issues, any flood issues or anything like that. And so we want to make sure that we look at those things, but we want to make sure that the area is full of patients, that competition ratio is good, that you have an opportunity to grow your practice, and that you can end up being very successful. And like I said earlier, this is just another example of another slide that shows that 1 mile, that 3 mile, that 5 mile. Now, what I probably didn't mention earlier is on these 1, 3, 5, it's going to have all the information that we had earlier. So it's not just going to give you the average of all three of those. It's going to give you what the actual number is on that 1, 3, 5 mile. So it's going to say in this situation, 11,000 population. On a 3 mile, it's 83. On a 5 mile, it's 246. And so a lot of times that number, that 246, that 5 mile, is not necessarily the most accurate. Now, when you start getting out to the outskirts of the city, that 5 mile is much more accurate. And so we usually take those into consideration. Our sweet spot when we're looking into the city or just outskirts of the city is that 3 mile radius. And so that's usually the, like I said, the pretty sweet spot that we like to look at. But again, we can always adjust that to be a drive time custom polygon, because we want to look at those natural barriers. And that's why you want somebody local to be able to really hone in on the markets that you want to serve. Competition analysis. So a lot of times doctors think that when they look at the competition ratio, say it says 1,700 to 1. Oh, that's right on the edge of the competition. Well, when we run these numbers, and when software, any kind of demographic software runs this information, a lot of times they are pulling potential practices that aren't what you are actually doing. So say you're an ortho doctor that doesn't plan on doing any general dentistry or, dentures or whatever it is, you might, but say you aren't. A lot of times these numbers will pull information that says, hey, there is 14 doctors in this 1 mile radius close to you. Well, some of those 14 could be general practice or endo. And so what we really want to do is make sure that that competition ratio is actually what the number says. If you're a general or you're an endo, you're a specialist, and you actually don't mind being next to a general dentist, we want to make sure that we put you in the right spot, and that you're, one, not going to be surrounded by people of the same practice. And so we really want to make sure that competition analysis is really true. And so we want to make sure that an ortho is not right next to you. If you do plan on doing general, it's not right next to you. If you plan on doing pedo, whatever it is, we want to make sure we put you in the right spot, and that the competition ratio that is being run is accurate. So this is a little side by side. Say we are looking, and this is a lot of times what we do. So a lot of times doctors will have a feeling, oh, I really like that location. And so it makes it much easier for us, because usually when you have a good feeling, that's usually a great sign. Because obviously it's good. I'll say good vibes, and I only say that just to be fun. But a lot of times when you go into a practice really confident, really excited, that's usually our practices that do the best. That means you are confident in your skills, that you're confident in you being a doctor, and you really just feel comfortable with it. And we sometimes say paralysis by analysis. A lot of times doctors will get way too caught up in the demographic reports and lack their really confidence in themselves that they can really crush it in a market regardless of what the competition is. I can give an example where we had a doctor, he was looking really towards downtown Houston. And so what he was doing, he found this third floor, and we were looking in the market, and we put this spot on there just in case. And so it was really for the first floor, but he saw really that the third floor is available. And so he really liked it. But when we ran the demographic numbers, the competition ratio was about 700 to 1. And so what ended up happening was we advised him. We told him, we were like, hey, if you really want to be in the spot, like, we're going to go where you want to be. But it is our job to put these numbers in front of you to really help you make sure you're making the right decision. And so that's what we did. We told him it's 700 to 1. It didn't look good, but we're going to support you to the fullest in what you want to do. And he's like, I really got a good feeling about it. Sure enough, we negotiated on it and everything. He went in there and he crushed it. He did about $1 million his first year. He really tailored his marketing to the area, made a little area in his practice, like a little art studio, really boutique. It was really nice, third floor, and really just paid attention to where he was at in the market and really dove in on it. But we say that to say, don't get paralysis by analysis. You still have to get in there and do the work. Even if the competition ratio is good and great, you still got to get in there and rock and roll. This slide really shows a side by side. So whenever you can't decide, we look at let's compare them. Let's see what the competition ratio is. Let's see what the population growth is. And so we go side by side on what that looks like. We can see what matches more of what we want to see. And as far as the competition ratio is, a side by side is good, but a side by side, and I think we have a slide on that, that is really more helpful when we really get into the economics of it. And so that's really, I think we have a slide on that, so I'll be able to get through that. But that's really the most important. But if we want to, we can do a side-by-side analysis of the competition ratios, really looking at the numbers, because again, this is a tool for us to put in front of us and to use to guide us in our direction that we want to be and to find us the best opportunity. Now, real estate factors, which I mentioned a few of them. Again, those natural barriers, that's one of them we have to pay attention to. Where we're at in the center is extremely important. A lot of times when you drive past these locations, your visibility is the first thing that people notice. So if you look at a retail center, when you drive past retail centers on your way to work, or this coming week, I would say drive through them and pay attention to those things, where the signage is, where the monument sign, which if you can't see my cursor, an example of a monument sign, if you can see in the picture, there's a navy squares or rectangles. That is considered a monument sign that basically has the logo of the business that's in that retail center. And so we obviously want to pay attention to that. Okay, do we have signage on the front? Are we in an inline space? Which an inline space is just the middle of the retail center that's not on the end spots. So on the end spots, which we call those end caps, are simply the left or right side of the edges of the building where you can have signage on the front and on the side. And so this is important for us to pay attention to, one, because of our cost. Our cost can go up when we have signage that is, on the front and on the side, versus if we were in line where we just have signage on the front. So we want to pay attention to those things. Where are the homes? Are they able to see them when they drive past? These are important things we have to look at. Now, you do have to negotiate on all these things. And so that's important for us to also know. So hopefully we'll be able to get into more of the weeds. It's just a recap, making sure we look in the area, we're looking at the insured. All right, we've looked at the insured, these are the insured areas. Are there schools, and if say we're doing pediatrics, ortho, those are really easy to serve because then we can just look for schools and churches, and makes it super easy, makes it simple because that's where your patients are. And so the closer we are to those, or where people drive to on those things, we want to see major anchors, again, blowing through this, but landscape, different things. But this is all stuff that we've covered. But again, it helps us really narrow down the areas. I like this slide simply because it embraces everything that we've looked at. And so you can start to see it narrowing down to where this individual wants to be. And so once we start doing that, it really gets us an area that's going to be perfect for the type of patients we want to see, the type of practice we want to have. And so it really helps us narrow down on those things. All right, this is extremely important. I wouldn't say this is the most important, but this is really a 6-step process. So this really goes into why we exist as XITE Realty and why we exist. So our job is to make this as easy for you guys as possible. And so taking all that information at the beginning, demographics and everything, and taking all the information that you tell us, okay, how big do I want my practice, all that kind of stuff, this is the kind of practice I want to see. We make it a very easy process for you guys. Educational. It's taking all the information. Once that's started, boom, we're ready to rock and roll. We put together what's called a custom prescribed set analysis, which is all that data stuff, all that information. We go out in the market, we see what areas match what you're looking for. And so then we use the demographics, like I mentioned earlier, to narrow down on sites and areas that are even closer to what you want to have. And so once we have taken that information, we've looked at the locations, we've then decided on the locations, and boom, we found our spots. What we usually do is we put a letter of intent, which I'll explain here in a second, for 1 or 2 locations. And the reason why we do that is we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. Sometimes a area or spot or location that we want to go to, something happens and we end up having to either pass on it. The landlord's not wanting to take care of a few things, and we're not able to negotiate as much as we want or what we need or what the bank requires. And so we have to move on to a different spot. Next slide would simply be the LOI. Actually, sorry, false. It'd be the construction, which I think the LOI portion is actually after. Perfect. I'm going to run through this one first because I think this is the most important. I don't want to be too long on this, but deal economics, whenever we find that location and wherever we have negotiated, started negotiations on it, that letter of intent, that is a non-legal, non-binding document that says, hey, we want to go to lease based off of these terms. And so what we are doing is bringing up any red flags, negotiating on everything we can negotiate before we start getting a real estate attorney involved. So the deal economics, super beneficial. So free rent, tenant improvement allowance, rental rate. So I like to go into the rental rate and tenant improvement allowance first, just because that is usually the foundation for the negotiations. So whenever we found the location, that 1 spot or 2 spots, whatever it is, we send in a letter of intent. We are negotiating on the rent, tenant improvement allowance. The rental rate, obviously our job is to negotiate that number down and as low as possible. The tenant improvement allowance is money that the landlord is going to give you towards your build out. And so it's really an incentive for you to go into their space. And what that does is essentially benefit them and it benefits you. So how it benefits them is the value of their retail centers are based off the rent roll. So the higher that rental rate is, the more valuable their building is. And so that free rent or tenant improvement allowance and the rent are super important to them. So the higher they can keep that rent, the better. So what they do to get that rental rate up is to give a lot of tenant improvement allowance. Now, that's good for you because that's upfront money that the landlord's going to give you towards the construction of your practice. And so now, some people value the long-term play. I shouldn't say the long-term play, more of the extended out money than they do the upfront cost. Some people care more about the upfront cost because they plan on opening a second practice fairly quickly, and so they need the money up front to get that one finished, rocking and rolling, so they can start focusing on the next one. There's pros, there's cons. I would say it's really just whichever pro you want to go with, but it's an incentive to keep that up, to keep that rental rate high. Now, those two things balance each other out. So the more tenant improvement allowance you get, the less negotiation power you have on the rent. But our job is obviously to get as much tenant improvement allowance as we can, to get as much, get a lower rental rate as we can, and to get as much free rent as we can. So that free rent is once the lease is basically started and you have built out your practice and you have signed a certificate of occupancy, all that kind of stuff, which there's no reason to get into all that today. But once you've started your lease and after you've built out, then you would have free rent. So you would pay the base rent, but you wouldn't pay what's called triple net. So your triple net is your taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. Basically like a fee that you and all the other tenants pay each month to keep up the flowers, to keep up the, slab and all that kind of stuff, walkway, whatever it is, the trash. You have to pay that each month. Now, with the free rent, you won't pay the rental rate, which is the base rent, but you will pay the taxes and insurance. So a lot of times, we'll negotiate, 3 months of free rent. So it helps with that upfront cost to where you're trying to build your practice, grow and make that happen. So the free rent's really important. There's a thing called commencement period, which is basically time for you to build out your practice. This is super important. So as of late, obviously with in the past with COVID, that slowed things down. And so obviously it has caused materials and things to basically be able to get and slow down. So contractors are moving a little slower. So we have to negotiate that. We have to negotiate how much time you have to build out your practice, because during that time, you're not paying any rent or taxes or insurance. And so we want to get as much time as we can to build out that practice. So that way you're not going to be stuck with paying rent and you don't even have a practice built out yet. So we have to negotiate on that. We have to negotiate on the tenant improvement allowance and the rental rate. Landlord and tenant responsibilities, pretty simple. We make sure that everyone knows what they're responsible for. The landlord is responsible for everything on the outside of that building. They're responsible for the roof, the slab, the exterior walls. So if you have a leak coming from the roof, the landlord is in charge of that. I can't tell you how many times I've had doctors call me and say, hey, I've got a leak coming from the roof and the landlord's not covering it. Well, it's in the lease, so he has to. And so then we can go back to the landlord and say, hey, it's in the lease. You got to cover this or you're going to be in default. And so we just want to make sure it's outlined and defined. It's negotiated. Signage, super important. Again, I mentioned it earlier. Whether if it's an inline space or an end cap, the landlord's going to have some sign criteria that you have to meet. We just want to make sure that you know exactly what you're getting into. That we can have signage on the front or on the monument sign, or have signage for reserved parking. A lot of times I ask doctors if they plan on doing any sedation, because a lot of times during these negotiations, we can say, hey, our doctor's going to have, sedated patients. We want to make sure that they at least have a pickup drop-off area, and that they're able to, put that out during their business hours at least. So that way they don't have, a future lawsuit or anything on their hands. Promotional signage, all that means is just coming soon or grand opening or even relocating signs. Surprisingly, all that has to be negotiated. How long you can keep it up has to be negotiated. It's kind of crazy how much you can get into the weeds when it comes to these negotiations on what you have, what you can cover. And that's why it's important to have someone like XITE Realty to really go in and to fight for you on all of these details. Because I promise you, there's going to be details that you don't realize that the landlord negotiates on or finds valuable. And sometimes you want something in the front of your practice that really draws in patients. And so we want to make sure that we can have, signage or whatever it is that you want to draw in patients to make your practice the way you want it. One of the most important things, permitted use and exclusive. Say you're an ortho. A lot of times, sometimes an ortho doesn't mind being next to a general dentist. But sometimes a general dentist doesn't want to be next to an ortho because they plan on doing ortho. And so we want to make sure that you have an exclusive right in the retail center to practice what you want to practice, whether that's ortho or general or pediatrics or endo, whatever it is. We want to make sure that you're the only one in the center that can do that, or that you have at least a say so on whether an ortho comes next to you. Because say you don't necessarily, mind having an ortho, but you want to at least have the ability to decide, okay, in the future, do I plan on doing ortho? Then I need to get that exclusive now, because I'm not going to be able to get it in the future. And say a tenant moves out and an ortho moves in, you're pretty much out of luck at that point, because then you don't have an exclusive on that. So we want to make sure that you're the only one that can have that dental use and that can run through that. Assignment language, very important. We have to negotiate this up front. This is really your exit strategy. This is saying, hey, when I'm ready to, one, retire or sell the practice or whatever it is, we have to make sure that you can sell to a person that you want to sell to, because the landlord's, I promise you, is going to have some criteria that you would have to meet. And so we have to look at that and make sure that, hey, we want to be able to sell to at least 80% of the dental market that's willing to purchase. Because a lot of times, landlords will say, hey, they have to have an equal value and equal experience as you. Well, you've been practicing for 10, 20 years. The likelihood of them having as much value and as much experience as you is pretty slim. And a lot of times it's a corporate group that comes in and scoops it up. And sometimes doctors don't want a corporate group to scoop it up. And so then you want to make sure that you're not limited on what you can do. And so we want to make sure that we are able to assign it to, the people we want to assign it to. We can sublease it. It just has to be negotiated up front. And so we want to make sure that we are able to do that. Let's see, hopefully it pulls up. Going back, because I want to go through the really the cost of having a practice. So construction cost, and the bank will be able to guide you through a lot of this, but this is a pretty brief overview. I will say that this is a older slide, and the numbers on the construction cost are much lower here than what they actually are now. So the construction costs now are roughly closer to 120 on the low end and 140 on the high end. And that's simply because of the time that we're at. It's just materials. The materials have gone up, and so the cost of construction has gone up. And so we obviously want to negotiate on the time that we can do that. And, we have to pay attention to those things. Now, the bank's going to guide you through that, but it's roughly falling between 120 and 140. Now, the exterior signage, it's about the same, 10 to 20,000. Usually, if it's an inline space, it's closer to 10,000. If it's, on an end cap where you have two signs, one on the front, one on the side, you're roughly looking at around $20,000. Marketing, we have seen people spend $20,000 to $30,000 a month on marketing, which is absurd. But we've seen people do it. That's what brings in your patients. This is budgeted for a year. So $20,000 for the whole year, $35,000 for the whole year. You can go over or lower, whatever you want to do. You can have celebrities, pay for celebrities, come with whatever you want to do. It's completely up to you on what you want to do marketing. If you need contacts for marketing, just let us know. We can introduce you to those people, lenders, we can introduce you to those people. I know TDA has connections with all those people. We can put the team around you that you need. Working capital, this is most important. So you want to keep it between 50 and 75. Anything over or anything lower is going to be a red flag to the underwriter, basically saying, hey, I'm not preparing enough, or I'm preparing too much for opening a practice. And so we want to make sure that we keep it in between 50 and 75. Now, again, the bank's going to guide you through it. And if you have any questions during that time, you can always ask us. But as a rule of thumb, just keep it between 50 and 75. Equipment, this is pretty on point right now. Really, just equipment's just taking a little longer to get, and so we obviously have to take that into account when we're negotiating the LOI. But the price is pretty much the same. If you want super high end, you're closer to 220,000. If you want low end, 120,000. It's completely up to you. Supplies, cotton swabs, all that kind of stuff, falls between 15 and 25. This is based off of 2,100 square feet, which would get you about 4 to 6 operatories. Usually it's 400 to 450 per operatory is the standard. It depends on what you like. Orthos have a bigger waiting room, because usually the family's involved, and so obviously the square footage might be a little bigger there. But we're seeing practices fall between $500,000 and $600,000. So take that in consideration whenever you guys are thinking about the cost. But again, the bank's going to help you a little bit through that, especially on the working capital. And we can always put some contractors around you that can kind of give you a quote on how much the practice is going to be. And that's it. That's all I have for now. And hopefully that was pretty informative on you guys. I know there's probably going to be some questions. And there's definitely going to be some more things whenever you are ready to get started that we can get into. But hopefully that was able to give you a brief overview. So I'll pretty much ask you guys if you've got any questions at this point. Hopefully I can answer them.
Hey, thanks, Blake. That was really informative. We do have a couple of questions that I'm seeing here. And, ladies and gentlemen, if you're not sure how to ask the questions, you can just type them into the question box on the right, and I'll monitor them and relay them over to Blake. So this is a good question if you can kind of review it. So how long does it take traditionally to actually open the practice? And I know you touched on it, but let's go back into that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So on average, it takes about 12 to 18 months. Now, that depends on if a building is already built. And sometimes it can depend on the doctor's timeline on what they want to do. So say they are finishing a residency, they got about a year left, but they want to be open in 2 years. Well, what we can do is tailor that and start looking for buildings that are going to be delivered in the next 18 months. And so then once that 18 months is up, you start construction. And by the time you're out of residency, you can then open up your practice. So, but I would say rule of thumb, 12 to 18 months, simply because that depends on if the building's built. If it's not built, we obviously have to wait for that building to be built. And there's pros and cons to that. You get a lower rental rate usually when you're trying to get there earlier. The sooner you can get to a market, the better. But 12 to 18 months is traditional time, because obviously you have to look for location. It takes a few months. You got to negotiate on it. It takes a few months. And then the longest part is obviously the construction, which takes about 6 to 8 months, depending on how quickly they move.
Okay. So this question here, I guess one of our doctors is from Houston. So it relates to that market specifically. So is Houston too saturated to open a practice right now? But I will ask, let's just be as general as possible in Texas. So if you have any insight into other, cities, that'd be helpful too. But this is really relates to Houston.
Okay. Yeah. So I can give pretty much most of Texas, because most of our offices, and obviously we've been working with the guys up in Dallas, Austin, San Antonio for a long time. Depends on where you go. So, and that's super important while we look at the demographic numbers. There are areas in Houston, also in Dallas, in Austin, and San Antonio that are not saturated. So a lot of times doctors will say, hey, this area, I just don't feel confident in Houston. I think it's too saturated area. Well, that depends on what you're looking for. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times areas are just changing. And so say you wanted a Medicaid practice, and so you decided, okay, I'm going to go open off of Highway 6. And then you want a second location that's going to be more fee for service, but you want it to be fairly close. Well, in the past, and I think I mentioned this earlier, in the past, Spring Branch was fairly Medicaid. Well, that's not the case very much anymore. Now, there's still some Medicaid over there when you start getting a little farther north, but that's not the case. And so that's why we really hone in on the demographic numbers. And a lot of times, based off of the numbers, even if we think a market's not saturated, the numbers really validate that. They simply say, no, it's not saturated yet. Now, I will say there are areas where we do find that are saturated, and we will let the doctor know that, hey, it is. And kind of like similar like my example earlier, where a doctor knew he was going into a saturated area. Granted, he was very confident, and going to that place, he knew the market very well. So a lot of times it depends on what you plan on doing, but there are areas that are not saturated.
All right, thanks for clearing that up, and it's a good explanation. It was a great question. Looks like we've got one more here, and one of those questions. So, how are y'all compensated?
That's a great question. We're fully transparent with that. And I should have mentioned it earlier. But so there's this 6% commission built into every deal, whether we're involved or not. If we aren't involved and you drive past a retail center and you're like, oh, I really like that building, there's a sign that says for lease. I call that number. Who you're talking to is the landlord broker. And so they represent the seller, person that owns the building. And so you start negotiating with them and everything, thinking, oh, I'm going to save some money on that. It's not using a broker. When really you end up losing a lot of money because there's a 6% commission built in every deal, whether we're involved or not. So if we aren't, then the landlord broker just keeps all 6%. If we are involved in Houston, we split the fee 4% for us, 2% for them. If it's in Dallas, I think it's 3 and 3. In Austin, I believe it's either 3 and 3 or 4 and 2, or even different than that, which is strange, but depends on the market. But that's how we're compensated. And to kind of give more detail, we're paid on the base rent for the term of the lease. And we're fully transparent with that. We think it's more valuable when you're fully transparent with those things. One, because we don't want there to be any black and white. We want it to be very, I mean, don't want it to be very, gray area. We want it to be very black and white. We want it to be transparent where the doctor knows, okay, this is how much of a cut, this is how much work he's put in, this is what he's getting paid. That's great. We never look for our clients to write us a check. So working with us is free. It's just like buying a house. The seller pays the fee. It doesn't cost you anything. I know some people think it does. It never does. We've never asked our clients to pay the fee, and we never will. Hopefully that answers that question. That can be a difficult one.
I think so. And again, ladies and gentlemen, you can reach out to Blake. You see his contact information there at the bottom of the slide. You can always contact me over at the TDA. My email is jepstein@tda.org. And phone number is 512-443-3675, and that's extension 161. Before we wrap it up, I want to add that, XITE Realty is really one of our real long-term partners. And, we've been working with them for several years. One of the great things that, in my opinion, that they provide TDA members, not just their services and what they do, but they do a lot of educational webinars. They write a lot of educational articles that we always put out, and we really appreciate that content. So there's a lot of learning that's involved with what they do and education that they provide. So that's always really important, whether you work with them or not. There's so much that they offer, and we really appreciate it. And you can also check out a lot of their videos that we put in our emails. That's usually once every quarter. You'll see a really interesting video in there, and we share them as well. So, we really appreciate what they do for us. And again, I also want to make sure that if you missed it earlier, the TDA Dental Concierge app, it's really easy to download. You can track your CE, see what you lack. You can get that high quality courses that you need at a low cost. And again, you can transfer your information directly to the TSBDE to comply with their auditing process. 100% free to TDA members, developed by the TDA, and that's tdadentalconcierge.com. So with that said, everyone have a great weekend. I don't see any more questions coming in. Blake, is there anything more you'd like to add?
No. Well, I will say, again, and I know you mentioned it, if you guys need anything, wife and I don't have kids just yet, so I've got time. So give me a shout. And if you can't get a hold of me, one of the guys in the Houston office, you can always go to our website and take a look at that. If you call one of those numbers, you'll be able to get in touch with us. But that's all I've got.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for being with us, and we really appreciate everything you've done in your time, Blake. Everybody Absolutely. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next month. Take care.